What are some examples of Axiom II?
There are a handful of examples that are used partially. So one of the things that's just inherent in the nature of Axiom 2 is that you're not really going to have a metaphor that's going to work well. Because the thing is that because the Axiom 2 dynamic is essentially moving back and forth through process itself, where it's essentially a description of process, then a metaphor ends up being kind of like a static description of something that's moving. And so as a result, the metaphor is just not going to cover the whole flow all the way around Axiom 2 without kind of introducing distortions that eventually break the metaphor. But we can see examples of each of the transitions with metaphors pretty readily. So, for example, for the um, transcendent to immanent transition, we mentioned choice. So, what does that look like? Well, choice starts with a multiplicity of things to select from. And why do we say multiplicity of things to select from? Well, because if there wasn't a multiplicity of things to select from, I can't distinguish between a choice and not a choice. So it's inherent that in order for it to be a choice, I need an actual plurality of things to choose from. And so, in that sense, the notion of things to choose from as options, as essentially possibilities, all of which are essentially notions that are connected to the notion of the transcendent. Now, what we're seeing is a plurality of the transcendent creates um, the singularity of a selection of one of those things. So, in other words, I have to actually make the selection in order for there to be a choice, again, under principle of identity. Because if I don't make the selection, then the choice hasn't happened yet. So, when we make the selection, we're essentially going from a multiplicity to at least something simpler than that, usually a singularity. So that idea of reduction of possibilities to specificness is a big piece of what we're thinking about when we think of choice. But it doesn't just stop there, of course. Like, so for instance, if we're saying, well, what kinds of things create a possibility? Like, each of those possibilities comes from somewhere. Well, to have the possibility to go to the movies, then somewhere along the way there has to exist a whole bunch of things like automobiles, roads, and movie theaters, not to mention the tape of the movie itself. And it might be nice to have all the things that exist, like friends to go with and people, I'm sorry, who will run the projector and things like that. So in this sense, there's a clear sense in which each possibility itself emerges out of the fact of multiple existing things. So if I instead wanted to go to a restaurant, I have to assume cars and roads and restaurants and presumably food distribution changes and cooks and all that kind of stuff. So, and if the notion of the possibility of I want to stay home and read a book, then I have to assume the existence of homes and books and presumably enough warmth and light to be able to read. So, in this sense, every single one of the selections comes from a multiplicity of existences. And if we want to go back even farther, we could say, well, where does the car come from? Well, where the road come from? Well, it's the result of lots of people's choices, i.e., for the road, all of the people that showed up to build it, and all the people that made the equipment to make the road, and all the people that you know dug the tar to make into the pavement, and so on. Right. So in effect, there's a huge amount of choice alignment that needed to happen, coordinated actions of lots and lots of people to build things like a road or a car or a chicken sandwich. So in this sense, each of the existing things in the modern world is a result of lots and lots of choices. Now, somewhere along the way, you could say, well, where did the chicken come from? Well, lots of choices of prior chickens choosing to mate with that chicken rather than that other chicken. And so, in effect, even the notion of evolution is to some extent predicated on choices, at least in this sense. So, there's obviously a lot more that can be said about this, but the point here is that we notice that in every one of these cases that in order to account for something, we have to account for it in terms of many prior things or many prior processes, and that in effect there's um, a sort of a continuance of this as I go backwards. It's always, as I go forwards, it's from many to one, and as I go backwards, it's from one to many. And in that particular sense, we can play it forward too. We can say out of every choice comes multiple outcomes, or every cause has multiple effects, and so on and so forth. But this is just basically built into the nature of process itself. It doesn't really change the nature of Axiom 2 fundamentally. It's just showing that in a lot of ways, the transcendent is about many to many relationships. And so we can therefore kind of say, well, in what sense is it helpful to understand process in the sense of the sequentiality of time? In which case, we're basically saying, well, we're accounting for the present in terms of the past, and we could just as easily account for the present in terms of the future. But in either case, it's a many to one transaction in the sense that we experience a singularity of the present. Right? There is a here and a now. That's just inherent in the nature of the first person perspective. Look
Yeah.
at look at triples that are in the table of correspondences and see if you can notice how the Axiom 2 process works in the flow. Like, so for instance, you notice in any given triple um, that's listed in that table, pick one that has all three elements. For ones that the transcendent or the immanent is missing, don't try to do those. It's probably too hard. But for the ones that are listed in all three, um, look at it in terms of process. Look at it in terms of dynamic. It's going to be really easy to slip into an omniscient way of thinking and not see the firsthand experience of it. So you have to, in a sense, be one of the modalities, particularly the immanent one, typically. But you have to somehow make it a process, or somehow see the triple as a dynamic, as a process, not as something looked at from the outside, but something looked at from the inside as a participant. And then from that position, the metaphor of how the Axiom 2 dynamic will probably occur to you. If it doesn't, we can explore it. But for the most part, that would be kind of the exercise to do. This is like I said, you'll notice that there are challenges because it's very easy to flip into a omniscient way of looking at it, and very hard to get out of that because that's been the Western mindset for so long. It's unconscious for most of us.